Hi everyone, and today we are going to debate about the contradictions of a dual heritage nation when dialogue stops. The specific topic is going to be about the indigenous community, indigenous people in Mexico, most specifically the Zapatista National Liberation Army, the thing they have with the Mexican government. So, to be a little bit in context, on January 1994, an armed indigenous uprising took place in southern Mexico by a group called the Zapatista National Liberation Army, or EZLN, raising their voice in direct opposition to the optimistic discourse of the then President Carlos Salinas, which was contradictory to the invisibility, discrimination, poverty, and marginalization that indigenous groups had been suffering for years. Extremely low wages, lack of basic services such as electricity or sewage, fewer access to education, lower economic development, labor exploitation, etc. After a process of difficult negotiations that went from criminalizing SZLN to a stagnation, retrieving of both sides and coming back to the table in April 2001, a constitutional reform on indigenous rights and culture was approved. Unfortunately, there are not regulations to enforce the application of such reform, which violates the Convention 169 of the International Organization of Labor, for example, and thus in 2003, Zapatista communities decided to create autonomous territories known as the Five Shells, Cinco Caracoles, which by the year 2019 had grown to a total of 12. These autonomous forms of organization focus on social cohesion and the betterment of living conditions for indigenous people. The other campaign, the other justice, the other education is what they highlight. The recognition of this autonomy seems to contradict the liberal principles of the Mexican Constitution based on a mestizo project and underlines the polemic about whether the law differentiates between different types of Mexicans. So now, we are going to begin with the different statements of the different parties that are going to be here involved. I'm just gonna present who we are representing. Carolina and Sofia, you could stop sharing the presentation if you like. Carolina, thank you. Carolina and Sofia are going to represent the EZLN, the indigenous communities. Antoine is going to represent the Mexican government, and myself, I am going to represent the United Nations.
Culture is who we are and what shapes our identity. Placing culture at the heart of development policies is the only way to ensure a human-centered, inclusive, and equitable development. It promotes tolerance and understanding between different cultures. It enriches the Mexican community through shared experiences with different people. It attracts more money to the Mexican economy through the growth of different businesses. An inclusive society is the one that considers that all the people have the same rights, simply because they are human beings. When a society doesn't recognize and grants the same value to all the citizens, the basic foundations of dignity are undermined and inequality and injustice are fostered. To meet the challenges of our ever more complex world, we'll need more diversity, more uniqueness, and individuality, and we will need to find new ways to blend it. A representative government in which minorities can have a space to speak and share their opinions and experiences, whereby they have real power to effect change.
At the same time, seeing as part of the issue is we are debating about having our land, to let indigenous communities have their own land and develop their customs without outside intervention is a way of letting diversity thrive, since the culture can be preserved and develop in its own space.
The 1991 constitutional reform that guarantees political autonomy to indigenous communities, the transparency agencies within the Mexican government, as well as the representative nature of the legislative body are only a few examples of how Mexico has embraced a multiculturalism at an institutional level. Therefore, the spirit under which the San Andrés agreements took place reflects the principles that the Mexican government has followed throughout the negotiations, recognizing the other as as a legitimate force, regardless of its occasional violent actions, has led to negotiation between equals in a reaffirmation of the new Mexican narrative of pluralism and multiculturalism.
The United Nations think that it is possible for the recognition of diversity and different cultural backgrounds, specifically of ethnic diversity, to exist alongside the recognition of equality. However, this can't be possible only by constitutional recognition. Let's take a look about the examples of groups such as Zapatista National Liberation Army in Mexico, who have raised their voice claiming extremely low wages, lack of basic services, and fewer access to education. Even though the Mexican government has had conversations and different negotiations with these groups, there still isn't an application of such reform, which violates the Convention of 169 of the International Organization of Labor. And also, let's keep in mind that Mexico signed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was adopted by the General Assembly on Thursday, 13 September of 2007. And today, the United Nations recommends all the states to follow this declaration, as it is the most comprehensive international instrument on the rights of indigenous people. It establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the indigenous peoples of the world. And it elaborates on existing human rights standards and fundamental freedoms as they apply to the specific situations of indigenous people. So it's not only about recognitions, we need to put our words into action and make sure every indigenous community has what they deserve. And I think that's the reason we are here today, to reach an agreement at the end of this debate. Thank you.
Yes, elaborating on that part of the agreement, as a representative of the Mexican indigenous community, the San Andres Agreement was supposed to be the agreement to give indigenous groups the right to decide our own legal systems, elect their own officials, and make their own laws. Yet the government hasn't really respected this agreement, and this is why Los Caracoles was born. They represent over 500 years of resistance from the indigenous groups, and is part of having a diverse world with distinct civilizations. That it reached a point, since the government wasn't listening to these groups, that these shells were needed for us.
The Mexican government is completely willing to continue the Pacific dialogue in order to update the procedures, as well as involvement of independent actors to monitor the advancement of pragmatic improvements in the indigenous population's autonomy. However, we would like to clearly state that we strongly condemn when social causes, such as the recognition of indigenous people as political actors with a certain autonomy, is weaponized with political purposes under the umbrella of liberation and false ideologies. Therefore, the government is strongly committed to continue the dialogue in order to develop solutions that effectively address the demands of the indigenous and other minority populations in vulnerable contexts.
Letting indigenous communities have their own land and develop their own custom is a way of letting diversity thrive, since the culture can be preserved. An environment in which everyone, not only these minorities, the ECLN, fight for their rights. Nevertheless, this should be done without silencing our voices. In other words, non-indigenous people should fight for indigenous rights, men should fight for women's rights, non-LGBTQ people should fight for LGBTQ rights. An example of how diverse communities and inclusive have exceeded is, take for example, the McKinsey says that ethnically diverse companies are 35% more likely to be in the top performing quartile companies. Plus, it's the right thing to do. The chances provided to people shouldn't be linked to skin color, age, religion, sexuality, gender, or disability, just as they shouldn't be linked to where they grew up or went to school.
Let's keep in mind that the acknowledgement of cultural diversity and intercultural dialogue help to diffuse the tensions that can arise in multicultural societies when a majority and minorities confront each other over the recognition of their rights. What favors cultural diversity, which is in no way opposed to the universality of human rights, is a governance of reconciliation, which is a direct guarantee of peace, one of the main objectives that the UN has. So culturally, the hegemonic discrimination faced by the indigenous, even by federal institutions, has proven to be extremely problematic. The highly complex nature of this issue suggests it will not be solved in the near future unless drastic economic and cultural changes are made. It is only with perseverance and dedication on the part of the indigenous, with support from the international community and the national government, that human rights may finally be realized for this vulnerable population. So saying that, I think it's time with all that has been said, to reach an agreement so all the parties involved can be satisfied about like the rights that every part of this debate deserves.
Well, if we may start, the Mexican government strongly agrees with what has recently been stated by the United Nations, in the sense that institutional arrangements as well as the legal framework should be a reflex of changing social demands in order for this political anatomy to be effective, functional, and legitimate. Nevertheless, and going in towards reaching an agreement, the Mexican government reiterates its commitment to dialogue, to plural debate, to the construction of democracy, but therefore it would like to state and would request the other parts to accept the following conditions, regarding that we will not tolerate any expressions of social demands that put in danger other citizens, as well as the integrity of the state and its monopoly of the force. Any action including violence and against human rights will be strongly condemned, and the individuals found responsible will be brought to the respective justice units, whether at the national or international level. Therefore, the Mexican government is strongly against false promises by other political forces, whether they are parties or any other sort of organization that try to implement incomplete processes, as if they were to guarantee diverse openness driven by political actors that are ultimately only using these as tools for electoral purposes. So the state fully supports an integral process of inclusion, diversity, and collaboration, regardless of political parties in power. So having said this, the Mexican government would like to listen to the opinion of the other parts involved. Thanks so much.
As the ESC and Ellen, we agree to stop having military movements as long as the government mentioned, you are compromised to listen and support our groups with supplies or things related to that, since so far having the military was our only means of defense against, well, outside movements. So as long as the government does follow up with their promise, we are willing to continue negotiations under peaceful conditions.
Okay, so thank you so much for, well, I don't know if Sophia would like to add anything else, or with what Caro said, it's enough to...
I think it's enough. I just want to clarify, and I'm thankful as representing the indigenous community that each of the parts gave their opinion, and we were able to reach an agreement, even though each of us has a different perspective.
Just to add something, as the Mexican government, we totally agree with the proposal sent by the Ezln and the indigenous movement, and therefore we believe that these frameworks of debate and dialogue contribute to building a stronger democracy, a more representative and participative democracy, and therefore we would like to carry out these exercises more often with any other actor within Mexican society that does not feel represented by this or by any other government.
Thank you all of you for sharing your proposals, and just the UN wants to remind you to follow the international guidelines of human rights, and also respect the conventions and the charters that have been signed by different parties, specifically by the Mexican government. And we are glad that you could see how having an intercultural dialogue can lead to new proposals of achieving peace in every aspect in the world. So thank you so much. I remind you also that you have the support of the international community if you ever need it. And thank you so much, everyone, for putting out what what they think and on the issue. And thank you for meeting here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.